"Please, give me back my crutch," pleads the little girl, trying to stand while the stepmother smiles mercilessly in front of everyone. But what was just humiliation turns into a heavy silence when the millionaire father appears at the door, and what he does next leaves everyone paralyzed. The pink crutches, propped beside the dark wood vanity, stood like two silent sentinels guarding Olivia's dreams. At 9 years old, she already understood them not as symbols of her weakness, but as extensions of her own stubborn will. They had been her faithful companions since the accident, and today, more than ever, she needed them to cross the battlefield awaiting her downstairs. The mansion, impeccable and cold, breathed a silence that weighed on her small shoulders. Every polished hallway, every strategically placed vase of imported flowers was a constant reminder that this place wasn't a home, but a stage. A stage set by Veronica, her stepmother, a woman whose elegance was as sharp as her indifference. The grand dinner of the week was about to begin. It was a crucial event for her father, Richard, a man whose brilliant business mind had made him a multimillionaire before he was 40. He was a master at turning capital into wealth, a visionary whose investments in the stock market and cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin were legendary. His fortune grew every second, in dollars, euros, and assets Olivia barely understood. But amidst all the success and constant cash flow, attention for his daughter seemed to be a dividend that was rarely paid out. Olivia knew her father loved her, but his love was a distant presence, overshadowed by stock charts and business calls that never ended. Tonight, she wanted to be seen, not as the fragile girl with the immobilized leg, but as part of that world, as the host's daughter. With an effort that made her bite her lower lip, she pulled herself from the chair to the wardrobe, leaning heavily on her left crutch. She chose a simple, light blue cotton dress her grandmother had given her. It contrasted with the oppressive luxury of the room, but it made her feel like herself. With trembling fingers, she combed her brown hair and pinned it to the side with a pearl barrette. The final touch, however, was the most important, a blue satin ribbon, the same color as the dress, which she carefully tied around the shaft of one of the crutches. It was her small act of rebellion, her way of saying that even with her limitations, she could still have beauty and grace. As she looked in the mirror, a shy smile bloomed on her lips. She felt pretty. She felt ready. The muffled sound of laughter and elegant conversation began to drift up the stairs, a murmur announcing the arrival of the guests. Olivia's heart quickened. It was time. Bracing herself, she took the first step toward the door, the blue ribbon swaying gently. Each movement was a small victory against the pain radiating from her leg. She didn't care. The prospect of sitting at the table with her father, of hearing the adult stories and feeling part of the family, was a painkiller more powerful than any medicine. The bedroom door swung open without warning, gliding silently on its hinges. Standing in the doorway, Veronica was the personification of perfection. She wore a black dress that hugged her slender frame, and a diamond necklace glittered at her throat. Her eyes, an icy blue, scanned the room and landed on Olivia. Veronica's smile was a work of art, perfectly drawn, but devoid of any warmth. She took in the girl, the simple dress, the pearl barrette, and finally, her gaze fixed on the blue ribbon tied to the pink crutch. The smile faltered for a microsecond, an almost imperceptible crack in her porcelain facade. The silence that fell was heavier than any words, and the air in the room seemed to chill instantly. Veronica's voice, smooth as silk, cut through the tense air. "Sweetheart," she began, the smile still fixed on her face, "I think it's best if you rest tonight. These dinners are for adults, full of conversations that would bore you." The words were sweet, but their intent was a poison Olivia was beginning to recognize. She tightened her grip on the crutch's handle, the smooth, cool plastic under her fingers. She lifted her chin, a small gesture of defiance she had learned to master. "I promise I'll be quiet," she replied, her voice a little louder than she intended, echoing her determination. "I just want to be with you, with Dad." The mention of Richard made Veronica's eyes narrow, ever so slightly, a reaction so quick it could have been imagined. The stepmother sighed, a theatrical sound of resignation. "All right," she conceded, her voice now tinged with a false tenderness. "But you need to be on your best behavior. We don't want any accidents, do we?" Olivia nodded eagerly, relief flooding her chest. The warning barely registered. All she could think was that she had won the first battle. Veronica stepped away, leaving the door open, a silent invitation for the girl to follow. The journey from her room to the top of the staircase felt like an eternity. The hallway was a vast tunnel of polished marble, and the sound of her rubber crutch tips created a lonely rhythm. Tap, drag, tap. Each step was calculated, demanding a balance that exhausted her. When she reached the landing, she paused, taking a deep breath. Down below, the world glittered. A crystal chandelier poured light over the guests, men in expensive suits and women with jewels that sparkled with every movement. Conversations flowed like a river, punctuated by laughter. Olivia caught snippets of phrases. Words like stocks, profitability, and new ventures, the vocabulary that defined her father's universe. Making her way down the steps one at a time, her body turned sideways and her hand gripping the banister, she felt like an intruder. No one seemed to notice her slow, careful descent. All eyes were on Veronica, who moved between groups with the grace of a perfect hostess, or on Richard, who was gesturing enthusiastically while explaining the potential of a new tech fund to an investor. When she finally reached the bottom step, her father saw her. A quick smile lit up his tired face. "Olivia, glad you could make it down, sweetie." He walked over, gave her a quick kiss on the forehead, and before she could say anything, was pulled back into the conversation by a man congratulating him on his portfolio's impressive growth. That brief moment of contact was all she got, an instant of warmth that vanished as quickly as it appeared. With her heart still warm from her father's kiss, Olivia turned toward the dining room. The table was set with breathtaking perfection, white linen tablecloths, silver cutlery, and orchid centerpieces. She spotted an empty seat next to her father's chair and began to move in that direction, the blue ribbon on her crutch swaying like a small flag of hope. She was just a few steps from her goal when Veronica appeared before her, blocking her path. The stepmother's smile was wide and radiant for the guests, but her eyes, fixed on Olivia, were as hard as glass. She bent down, adjusting a lock of the girl's hair, a gesture that looked affectionate to anyone watching from afar. "Honey," Veronica whispered, her voice a thread of steel disguised as honey. "The main table is for people who can carry themselves properly. You sit over there by the window, okay? It's a safer place for you." The spot she indicated was a small armchair, isolated in a corner of the room, far from the light and warmth of the main table. Veronica's words, "It's a safer place for you," echoed in Olivia's mind like a death knell. The safety her stepmother offered was that of invisibility, the protection of being forgotten. The girl's heart, which had been beating with the hope of belonging, began to wither like a flower deprived of sunlight. She swallowed the lump that had formed in her throat and, without a word, began the slow trek toward the corner. Each step was a monumental effort, not just physically, but emotionally. The sound of her crutches on the marble floor seemed accusatory, an irregular rhythm breaking the symphony of civilized laughter and conversation. The guests, immersed in discussions about stock market volatility and the promise of new investments, barely noticed the small figure moving along the periphery of the glow, like a satellite cast out of its orbit. Finally, she reached the armchair. It was velvet, soft and deep, but to Olivia it felt like a throne of isolation. She sat down, her body sinking into the upholstery, and carefully propped the pink crutches beside her. From her position, The grand dining table was a distant spectacle. She could see her father's back, the animated gestures of his hands as he spoke about the importance of diversifying assets. Mentioning gold and real estate funds, he seemed so powerful, so unreachable. An ocean of luxury and indifference separated them. Amidst the crowd of unknown faces, one pair of eyes met hers. It was Helen, the housekeeper, a middle-aged woman with a face etched with a tired kindness. She was standing near the kitchen door, and in her gaze, Olivia saw a flicker of compassion, a silent sadness that said everything. Helen understood, but she was powerless, a pawn in a game whose rules were dictated by Veronica. Dinner was served. Waiters moved with silent efficiency, filling glasses and serving elaborate dishes. The aroma of the food reached Olivia, making her stomach rumble, but no one offered her a plate. It was Helen who, a few minutes later, approached discreetly with a small plate of hors d'oeuvres and a glass of juice. "For you, dear," she whispered, placing it on a small table beside the armchair. The gesture was a balm on the open wound in Olivia's chest. She thanked her with a weak smile and picked up a small linen napkin. As she tried to balance the plate on her lap, her clumsy fingers let the napkin slip. It fluttered slowly to the floor, landing at a distance that seemed insurmountable. Olivia leaned forward, stretching her arm as far as it would go, but her fingertips barely brushed the fabric. Trying to stand without her crutches was risky. She looked around, hoping someone would notice her struggle. One of the guests, a man with a grey mustache sitting near the end of the table, saw her. "Looks like the little lady dropped something," he said aloud, with an amused tone. Heads turned. For an instant, all eyes were on her. Olivia's face burned with shame. Veronica, from her place of honor, smiled with condescending sweetness. "Don't you worry, Mr. Henderson. Olivia's just a little clumsy today." The phrase, spoken aloud, sealed the girl's image as a lovable nuisance, but a nuisance nonetheless. Helen, seeing the humiliation in the child's eyes, took a step forward, ready to intervene and pick up the napkin. But before she could move, she met Veronica's gaze. The stepmother said nothing. Just a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head and a hardening in her eyes were enough. Helen froze mid-step, her body rigid, her face a mask of conflict. The white napkin remained on the floor, a small ghost of her hope, just a few feet away but completely out of reach. The napkin on the floor became the epicenter of Olivia's universe. The entire world had shrunk to that small square of white linen. The conversations around the table, a cacophony of terms like net worth, compound interest, and inheritance, sounded like a foreign language from a distant planet. Every laugh, every clink of glasses accentuated her solitude. The humiliation was a bitter taste in her mouth. Stronger than the grape juice Helen had brought her, she watched her father, at the center of it all, explaining to a group of fascinated men how he had built his fortune from a modest initial investment. He was the sun, and all the other planets revolved around him. Olivia, however, felt adrift in the darkness, beyond the reach of his light. A wave of stubbornness rose in her chest, a small ember of defiance in the cold indifference. She would not stay here, defeated. She would get the napkin. It was then that Richard's phone vibrated on the table. He glanced at the screen and his expression shifted, the familiar mask of business urgency settling onto his face. "Excuse me." "Gentlemen," he said, standing up. "An important call from Tokyo. I'll be right back." He gave a wink in Veronica's direction, a gesture of complicity that made Olivia's stomach churn, and walked briskly out of the dining room toward his study. His absence created a power vacuum, a space Veronica filled instantly. Her posture seemed to straighten even more, her smile growing more confident. With Richard out of the room, the stage was all hers. The conversations at the table continued, unshaken. The host's departure was just a brief interlude in the spectacle of wealth. Veronica rose with a studied elegance, as if to simply check on her guests' well-being. She circled the table, sharing a kind word here, a smile there. Her movements were fluid, hypnotic. No one noticed that her trajectory was leading her, inevitably, to the dark corner where Olivia sat. The girl felt a shiver run down her spine as she saw her stepmother approach. She tried to shrink into the armchair to make herself even smaller, invisible, but there was no escape. Veronica stopped beside her, her expensive perfume enveloping Olivia like a suffocating mist. She leaned in, her diamond necklace brushing the girl's shoulder, and pretended to fluff the cushion behind her back. "You're drawing too much attention, dear," Veronica whispered, her voice so low it was almost a thought. The smile on her face didn't reach her eyes, which glittered with a cruel coldness. People with this much money don't like distractions. They like perfection. Before Olivia could process the meaning of those words, Veronica's hand descended and, with a swift, precise movement, snatched one of the pink crutches. "Let's see if you can behave without this." Shock coursed through Olivia's body. She let out a small gasp, the sound swallowed by the ambient noise. Instinctively, she reached out to take back what was hers, but Veronica had already straightened up, holding the crutch like a scepter. Olivia's balance, already precarious, gave way. She listed to the side, her body trembling, and only saved herself from falling completely by planting her palm against the cold wall. "Please," she begged, her voice a quavering thread of desperation. "Give it back." The plea floated in the air between them, fragile and useless. Veronica just smiled, a self-satisfied smile, and her gaze drifted slowly down, fixing on the single crutch that remained beside the armchair. Olivia's plea, fragile as a spider's thread, dissolved in the air. Veronica ignored it completely. With the first crutch held firmly in her hand, she reached for the second. Her movement was disguised with a performative concern, an act for the audience of guests who, from time to time, cast curious glances toward the corner of the room. "Oh, darling, let me get this one out of the way too," she said, her voice loud enough to be heard by anyone nearby. "We wouldn't want anyone to trip and get hurt, would we? Safety first." The pretext was paper-thin, but coated in a veneer of solicitude, it became unassailable. To the world, she was the attentive stepmother, looking out for her clumsy stepdaughter's well-being. To Olivia, she was the architect of her prison. With a quick motion, Veronica took the second crutch. Now she held both, the pink shafts looking like a bizarre trophy in her perfectly manicured hands. Olivia's last point of support was gone. Her body, already unstable, lost its battle with gravity. It wasn't a sudden fall, but a slow, humiliating slide. Her hand slipped down the smooth wall, and she crumpled softly against the baseboard, her hip hitting the marble floor with a dull thud only she could feel. Shame washed over her, a hot wave that rose up her neck and set her face on fire. She curled into herself, pulling the blue dress over her knees, trying to become the smallest possible target for the eyes she felt upon her. On the other side of the room, Helen, the housekeeper, watched it all unfold, her heart clenched in her chest. Her hands tightened into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to help the girl, to confront Veronica's cruelty. But fear paralyzed her. She depended on this job, and Mrs. Veronica had the power to destroy her life with a single word. Her silence was the price of her survival. Veronica, with both crutches in hand, walked elegantly toward a corner near the large velvet curtain covering the window. "I'll just put these here, safe and sound for you," she said, still in her public, caring tone, as she carefully hid them behind the heavy fabric. The blue satin ribbon, Olivia's small symbol of hope, disappeared into the darkness. At the table, the conversation about the business world continued, oblivious to the silent drama unfolding just feet away. "This quarter's profits exceeded all expectations," a man was saying, raising his glass. "Richard, your assets seem to multiply on their own. You must have the Midas touch." The laughter that followed sounded to Olivia like the roar of a distant monster. She was on another plane of existence, a cold, hard world, measured in inches of marble. The floor, once just a surface to walk on, was now her horizon. The chair legs looked like trunks in an impenetrable forest, and the guests' voices were distant thunder. The plate of hors d'oeuvres and the juice Helen had brought were on the small table just above her, so close and yet so impossibly far. Hunger and thirst mixed with pain and humiliation, creating a knot in her stomach. With trembling hands braced on the cold floor, she looked up at the armchair she had fallen from. It looked like a mountain. With all the strength she could muster, she pushed herself, trying to drag her body back to the relative safety of the soft velvet. The effort to move was excruciating. The cold marble seemed to sap the warmth from her body, and her immobilized leg was a dead weight she had to drag. Every inch gained was a battle. The voices at the dinner table merged into an indistinct buzz, a cruel soundtrack to her silent struggle. She could hear a man complimenting Veronica on the party. "Such impeccable organization, my dear. It reflects the mind of a business genius. Richard doesn't just accumulate great wealth, he displays it with unparalleled class." Veronica accepted the compliment with a modest smile, but her eyes shone with a cold triumph. She shot a quick glance in Olivia's direction, a look that lasted only a second but carried the full weight of her victory. In that gaze, Olivia read the message: "You are exactly where I want you to be." A contained sob burned her throat. She would not give Veronica the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Swallowing her tears, she focused on a new goal. The armchair now seemed too far away, but there was something else. Her eyes scanned the room, past the expensive shoes and the hems of dresses, until they landed on the base of the velvet curtain. And then she saw it, a tiny, almost imperceptible flash of pink. It was the buckle of one of her crutches, which Veronica had failed to hide completely. The sight of that small piece of her support, of her independence, ignited a new flame of determination in her chest. That was where she would go. Meanwhile, in the kitchen doorway, Helen fought her own internal war. The image of the girl dragging herself across the floor was torture. She was the daughter of a man whose fortune was so vast it was spoken of in billions, an empire built on the cold logic of profit and dividends. Yet his only heir was being treated like nothing. Helen felt the weight of her own cowardice. She should march over there, pick the child up, face Veronica's fury, and accept the consequences. But the image of her own children, of her bills to pay, of her precarious life, kept her rooted to the spot. Her emotional and financial liabilities were chains that bound her. She looked away, unable to keep watching, and the sound of cutlery on porcelain seemed to mock her own powerlessness. Olivia began to crawl toward the curtain. The movement was slow, awkward. Her cotton dress bunched up under her knees, hindering every advance. She ignored the throbbing pain in her leg, the burning in her arms. Her focus was entirely on that spot of pink light. It was her salvation. The contrast between her struggle and the opulence around her was dizzying. Laughter erupted as one of the guests told an anecdote about a stock trade in Frankfurt. The chime of crystal glasses rang out as they were raised for a toast to future deals and the continued profitability of our investments, declared a white-haired man. And amidst it all, the child on the floor, crawling for her crutches. She was close, so close. A few more inches and her fingers would reach the edge of the curtain. The velvet fabric felt like a promise of refuge. She could smell dust and the lingering trace of Veronica's expensive perfume. She gathered the last of her strength for a final push. The sound of her dress dragging across the marble was the only thing she could hear. The rest of the world had faded away. Her hands stretched out, fingers splayed, the tips almost touching the heavy fabric, and then a sound cut through the air. It wasn't laughter, nor the clink of a fork. It was a click, a sharp, definitive sound. The sound of Richard's heavy office door opening down the hall. The murmur at the dinner table faltered, then ceased completely. A sudden, dense silence fell over the room. The silence that descended upon the dining room was unlike any Olivia had ever heard in that house. It wasn't the calculated silence of Veronica, nor the busy silence of her father. It was a heavy silence, charged with a sudden tension, like the still air before a thunderstorm. All eyes, once fixed on each other or on the lavish plates, converged on the entrance to the hall. Richard stood there, his phone still in one hand, the other relaxed at his side. His posture was calm, but there was something in his eyes, an observant stillness, that made Olivia's heart stop for an instant. He wasn't looking at the table, at the guests who stared back at him with frozen smiles. His gaze swept the room and landed, with devastating precision, on the floor. He saw her. He saw his daughter, her blue dress crumpled, her hair disheveled, splayed out on the cold marble. He saw her outstretched hand, just inches from the velvet curtain. And then his gaze moved slowly, following the direction of her gesture, and found what she was reaching for, the pink glint of the crutch buckle, hidden in the shadows. The entire scene unfolded for him in a fraction of a second, a puzzle whose pieces snapped together with brutal clarity. Richard's face remained impassive, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The satisfied smile on Veronica's face dissolved, replaced by a mask of anxious surprise. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, shattering the silence. "Darling, you're back!" Her voice sounded artificially bright. "Olivia had a little tumble, that's all. Children, you know how they are." Richard didn't answer. He took one slow step into the room, then another. His expensive shoes made almost no sound on the floor, but each step echoed like a silent thunderclap in the charged atmosphere. The guests, sensing the tectonic shift in the mood, remained motionless, cutlery suspended in mid-air, conversations forgotten. It was as if a play had been interrupted by an actor who refused to follow the script. His gaze finally left the floor and rose to meet Veronica's. It was a long, deep look, devoid of any emotion she could decipher. There was no anger, no accusation. There was only a cold, terrible knowing. Veronica's facade began to crumble. A slight tremor ran through her lips as she tried to maintain her smile. He walked directly to the curtain, the imposing velvet curtain that had become an accomplice to her cruelty. With a calm motion, he pulled the fabric aside, revealing the two pink crutches propped against the wall like two forgotten prisoners. Olivia's blue ribbon looked like a satin tear against the vibrant pink. A collective, indrawn breath swept through the room. The truth, stark and raw, was exposed under the light of the crystal chandelier. There was no more room for excuses or dissembling. The image of the hidden crutches was a silent confession, more powerful than any words. Richard bent down, picked up the crutches, and straightened. He held them for a moment, the childish plastic contrasting with his expensive suit and his aura of power. A man whose fortune could buy islands, but who now held the fragile pillars of his daughter's world. Then he turned to Veronica, and the voice that came from his lips was steady, sharp, and irrevocable, breaking the silence like a sheet of ice cracking. "What is going on here?" Richard's question hung in the air, simple in its phrasing but carrying the weight of a verdict. It wasn't a search for information. It was a demand for an accounting. Veronica's face, normally a canvas of flawless control, contorted in a desperate attempt to regain her balance. "Darling, I told you," she began, her voice a little higher than usual. "She got tangled up. She fell. I just put the crutches away so no one would trip. I was looking out for everyone's safety." The lie sounded flimsy, pathetic, against the pink evidence Richard held in his hands. He didn't look at her with anger. What was in his eyes was something far worse: disappointment. a cold, profound disappointment that stripped her bare in front of everyone. Ignoring her completely, as if she were just another piece of furniture, Richard walked to Olivia. He knelt on the marble floor, the expensive fabric of his pants creasing without a second thought. The world of business, of assets and liabilities, disappeared. In that moment, he was not the multimillionaire, the master of the financial universe. He was just a father facing his daughter's pain. He held out the crutches to her. "Here you are, sweetie." His voice was soft, a refuge in the storm. Olivia looked at her father's face, seeing in it an attention, a presence she hadn't seen in a very long time. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were not of humiliation, but of overwhelming relief. She took the crutches, her small hands wrapping around the familiar plastic, with a gentleness that contrasted with his public image as a ruthless tycoon. Richard helped her to her feet. He held her steady, waiting for her to find her balance, to feel safe again. Once she was standing, he didn't let go. He kept a protective arm around her shoulders and guided her step by step toward the dining table. The silence from the guests was absolute. They watched the scene as if hypnotized, witnessing the collapse of an empire built on appearances. Richard didn't stop at just any seat. He led her to the head of the table, the main chair, the place Veronica had occupied with such pride. With a deliberate motion, he pulled out the chair and helped Olivia sit down. The act was seismic. Placing the fragile, humiliated child in the seat of power was a declaration. It was the realignment of the entire universe of that house. Olivia, sitting in the high-backed chair, felt like a queen on a throne she hadn't asked for. From her new vantage point, she could see everyone's face. She saw confusion, embarrassment, and in a few, a flicker of admiration. And she saw Veronica, standing in the middle of the room, pale, her hands clenched into fists, the very picture of defeat. Richard remained standing beside his daughter, a hand resting gently on her shoulder. He then addressed the table, his gaze sweeping over each of the shocked faces. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried an authority that no volume could ever purchase. "I apologize for this interruption," he said, the formal tone barely concealing the emotion beneath. "It appears that in this house, the rules have changed." He paused, letting the words sink in, before delivering the final sentence that would seal Veronica's fate. "In this house, kindness rules, and anyone who laughs at a child's pain will no longer eat at this table." Richard's words fell upon the dinner table with the weight of marble slabs. The banquet, once a celebration of wealth and power, had turned into a wake. No one dared to touch their silverware. The aroma of the food, once appetizing, now seemed cloying. The silence was so profound you could hear the distant hum of an air conditioner. The guests, masters of high-stakes negotiations and eloquent speeches on capital markets, were utterly disarmed. They exchanged uncomfortable glances, avoiding the eyes of both Veronica, petrified in her humiliation, and Richard, whose calm was more intimidating than any outburst of rage. Veronica tried to speak. She opened her mouth, perhaps to argue, to apologize, to try to piece together her shattered image of perfection. But no sound came out. Her face, a mask of melting wax, contorted. With a stiff movement, she turned and walked out of the dining room, her footsteps echoing her defeat. The dinner party was, for all intents and purposes, over. One of the guests, an older man who had known Richard for years, cleared his throat and stood. "Richard, I think it's getting late. It's been a memorable evening." It was the signal everyone had been waiting for. One by one, the guests rose, murmuring excuses and hurried goodbyes, eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere. Within minutes, the dining room, once buzzing with life and laughter, was empty. Only the untouched food and half-full crystal glasses bore witness to what had transpired. Richard remained by Olivia's side until the last guest had left. Then he sighed, a deep sound that seemed to come from his soul, and pulled up a chair to sit beside her. He said nothing for a long time, just took his daughter's small hand and held it between his own. The contact was warm, real. Olivia looked at her father, at the man she saw more often on computer screens and the covers of business magazines than in her own home. Tonight, she saw something new in him, a vulnerability that made him more human, more of a father. "Forgive me, sweetie," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "I was so busy building a portfolio, a fortune, that I forgot about my greatest treasure." Those words were everything Olivia needed to hear. The tears she had held back so fiercely finally rolled down her face, washing away all the pain and loneliness. They were tears of healing. Richard pulled her into a hug, and she buried her face in the soft fabric of his suit, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne. In that moment, the silent mansion finally began to feel like a home. In the days that followed, a quiet but profound transformation began to take place in the house. Richard cancelled meetings, postponed trips. His focus, once split between the New York Stock Exchange and the crypto markets in Shanghai, was now entirely within those walls. The first visible change was the removal of the thick, slippery Persian rugs that covered the hallways. Richard had them replaced with non-slip runners, making it easier and safer for Olivia to get around. It was a small but symbolic gesture. He was, quite literally, clearing the obstacles from her path. He also had a long talk with Helen, the housekeeper. He apologized for his own blindness and gave her a new assignment: to accompany Olivia to her physical therapy sessions, not as an employee, but as a companion. And then, he made the biggest change of all. His sacred study, the nerve center of his financial empire, was emptied. The stock tickers, the phones, the market reports, everything was removed. On the walls where stock charts once hung, he had shelves installed for paints, canvases and brushes. The place where he multiplied his money became an art studio for his daughter. The old study, now bathed in the natural light that streamed through windows no longer shrouded by heavy curtains, became Olivia's sanctuary. The smell of leather and paper was replaced by the sweet scent of oil paint and turpentine. There, surrounded by blank canvases that promised infinite possibilities, she began to flourish. The pink crutches, which had once been a symbol of her struggle against the house's indifference, were now just tools that carried her from one explosion of color to another. She painted with a freedom she had never felt before. She painted vibrant blue skies, fields of yellow sunflowers, and sometimes just blurs of color that expressed the emotions for which she still had no words. Richard spent hours with her in the new studio. Sitting on a stool in the corner, he would watch her, fascinated. He, a man who understood the world through numbers, interest rates, and cash flow, was learning a new language, the language of color, of form, of his daughter's pure joy. As the bond between father and daughter deepened, Veronica became a shadow in the house. She moved through the halls like a ghost, her presence a dissonant note in the new harmony that was taking root. The facade of perfection had crumbled, and what remained was a bitter woman, consumed by her loss of control. She didn't scream or make scenes. Her weapon was silence, an accusatory silence that tried to poison the atmosphere. But Olivia's newfound happiness and Richard's devoted attention created a force field that her resentment could not penetrate. The house, once the stage for her power, was now the setting of her irrelevance. One afternoon, while Richard was helping Olivia mix a specific shade of green, Veronica walked into the studio. She wore an impeccable dress, and her hair was perfectly styled, an attempt to cling to the last vestiges of her former identity. Her face was carefully made up to hide the dark circles under her eyes, but her eyes couldn't disguise her defeat. "Richard, can we talk?" she asked, her voice controlled but brittle. Richard looked at Olivia, who had stopped painting and was watching the scene with apprehensive eyes. "Of course, sweetie. You keep working on your tree. I'll be right back." He stood and followed Veronica to the living room, the very place where, weeks before, her empire of appearances had come crashing down. "I know I was wrong," Veronica began, the words rehearsed. "I was cruel, and there's no excuse for what I did, but I was under so much pressure. The pressure of maintaining this house, of being the perfect wife for a man like you, a billionaire whose name everyone reveres. I lost myself, but I can change. I am so sorry." The words were correct, but the tone lacked true contrition. It was a performance, another attempt at manipulation, a calculated investment in search of an emotional return. She tried to touch his arm, but he subtly moved away. Richard listened to her in silence, his face impassive, like a seasoned investor analyzing a flawed business proposal. He saw no remorse in her eyes. He saw fear, the fear of losing the status, the wealth, the assets that defined her existence. He thought about their years together, the dinners, the trips, and realized with a painful clarity that it had all been transactional. He provided financial security and a powerful last name. She provided a facade of perfection. It was a business deal, not a marriage. And now, the contract had been breached. Richard looked at Veronica, but he no longer saw her as his wife. He saw her as a risk analyst assesses an investment that has proven to be fraudulent. The fundamentals were false. The promise of return was an illusion, and the only logical course of action was to liquidate the position before the losses grew even larger. Her performance was technically perfect. The right words, the correct tone of voice, the studied expression of remorse, but the authenticity, the true emotional capital, was missing. He could see the calculations behind her eyes, the fear of losing access to the fortune she had worked so hard to manage as if it were her own. She didn't regret the pain she had caused, but rather the miscalculation that had led to her being caught. He finally broke the silence, his voice calm and devoid of hatred. Hatred would require a passion he no longer felt. "You talk about pressure, Veronica, but what you did wasn't an act of desperation, it was an act of pleasure." The word pleasure hung in the air between them, cruel and precise. "I saw your face that night. I saw the satisfaction in your eyes when my daughter was on the floor. That isn't a mistake. That's your character." He paused, giving her a chance to refute him, but she remained silent, shock paralyzing her lips. "I have spent years of my life," he continued, "accumulating assets, building a net worth that the papers love to speculate about. I built an empire of numbers, thinking that was strength. But true strength is found in kindness, and that is a treasure you have never understood." Veronica's mask finally fell. The feigned remorse evaporated, revealing the cold contempt that had always been underneath. "So, this is it," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You're going to throw it all away for some sentimental whim, for that girl." The way she said "girl" was the final confession, stripped of all artifice. Richard was unmoved. "I'm not throwing anything away. On the contrary, I'm finally making the right investment." He turned, ending the conversation, the empire, the marriage. "Remorse doesn't erase what is done with pleasure," he said over his shoulder, his voice firm. "And I can no longer live with you." He walked away, leaving her alone in the living room, a deposed queen in a kingdom of expensive furniture and solitude. Richard returned to the art studio, and the transition was like walking from winter into spring. The air in there was light, filled with the smell of paint and the soft music Olivia liked to listen to as she worked. She had her back to the door, completely absorbed in her canvas. She was painting a pair of pink crutches, but instead of looking like medical devices, they were covered in vibrant flowers and butterflies, as if they had sprouted from the earth itself. Richard stopped, his heart tight in his chest. In that simple image, his daughter had rewritten her own history. She had taken a symbol of her pain and transformed it into something beautiful, full of life and hope. It was a lesson in resilience more profound than any business strategy he had ever learned. He approached silently and placed his hands on her shoulders. Olivia started for a moment but relaxed when she saw it was him. "Dad, what do you think?" she asked, pointing with her paintbrush at the painting. Richard looked from the canvas to his daughter's face, her eyes shining with innocent pride. He realized that all his billions, all the gold in his vaults, all the stock in his name were worthless compared to this one moment. This was his true inheritance. "I think, my darling," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "that it is the most valuable work of art I have ever seen in my entire life." Olivia beamed, a smile that lit up the whole room. Richard looked again at the painting, at the flowered crutches, and an idea began to form in his mind, a bold idea that could change not only their lives, but the lives of many others. The idea that sparked in Richard's mind was like a seed planted in fertile soil, growing rapidly, nourished by the emotion of the moment and his newfound clarity of values. He looked around the studio, at the dozens of Olivia's paintings that now adorned the walls, explosions of color and feeling that had transformed his former fortress of capital into an oasis of creativity. Each canvas was a testament to his daughter's journey, from her silent suffering to her exuberant rediscovery of joy, and at the center of it all, the painting of the flowered crutches. It wasn't just a pretty picture, it was a manifesto. It was proof that beauty could be born from adversity, that strength could be found in the most unexpected places. That night, after tucking Olivia into bed, Richard didn't go to his own. He returned to the studio, now quiet and bathed in the silvery light of the moon. He sat in the small chair where he used to watch his daughter paint and picked up a legal pad. For the first time in years, he wasn't sketching out investment strategies or analyzing a company's balance sheet. He was drawing up a blueprint for the future, a future that wouldn't be measured in dollars or euros, but in human impact. Olivia's painting had lit a fuse. What if they could take that message of hope beyond the walls of this mansion? What if they could turn one child's pain into a force for good for countless others? The night passed in a blur of feverish planning. He called his lawyers, his financial advisors. The conversations, however, were different. He wasn't talking about maximizing profits or the ROI on his holdings. He was talking about creating a foundation, an organization dedicated to providing support, both physical and emotional, for children with mobility challenges. The name came to him instantly, the Pink Butterfly Project. The logo would be the image from Olivia's painting. The most pivotal moment wasn't a confrontation, a heated argument, or a dramatic twist. It was a moment of profound introspection. Richard sat at his desk, now in the small corner he'd set up for himself in the library, and looked at a statement of his net worth. The numbers stretched across the page, an almost absurd string of zeros. It was a fortune that could last for generations, an empire of assets and ventures. He picked up a pen. Next to the grand total, the number representing his life's work, his entire business genius, he began to write. He allocated a substantial sum, a significant piece of his empire, to be the foundation's seed capital. It was not an investment to generate more wealth. It was a transfer, a conversion of financial capital into human capital. As he signed the document authorizing the transaction, his hand didn't shake. There was a certainty in his gesture, a peace he hadn't felt in years. It was an act of divestment that left him richer than ever before. The next morning, he told Olivia his plan. They were in the studio, and the morning sun illuminated the painting of the crutches. The girl's eyes widened as her father explained about the foundation, about how her art would help other children feel strong and beautiful. "So, my drawing is going to turn into real help?" she asked, her voice full of awe. "More than that, sweetie," Richard replied, kneeling to be at her eye level. "Your drawing is going to turn into hope." In that instant, something shifted in Olivia. The girl who had been humiliated, who had felt like a burden, understood her own power. She was not defined by her immobilized leg, but by her ability to create, to inspire. She looked at her own pink crutches leaning against the wall. Then she looked at the painting. And then, with a quiet determination, she turned to her father and said something that left him speechless. "Daddy, I don't need them to be just pink anymore." Olivia's words, "Daddy, I don't need them to be just pink anymore," resonated in the studio with the force of a revelation. Richard looked at his daughter and saw, for the first time, not the fragility he needed to protect, but a strength he needed to admire. She wasn't rejecting the color he had chosen to try and sweeten her reality. She was claiming the right to add her own colors, to paint her own journey. In that moment, he understood that the greatest part of Olivia's healing wouldn't come from doctors or therapies, but from within herself. The humiliation she had suffered hadn't broken her. It had forged her. He knelt and hugged her, a hug of pure pride and reverence. "You're right, my little artist," he whispered. "They can be any color you want." The final resolution of the past arrived the next day, quietly and anticlimactically. 2 designer suitcases stood in the foyer. Veronica came down the stairs, already dressed for her departure. There were no shouts, no tears, no pleas, just a cold, administrative silence. Like the closing of a business deal gone bad, Richard watched her from the library doorway. He thought of their marriage in terms he understood well, a merger. She had brought her assets of beauty and social sophistication, he, his vast capital and status. For a time, the partnership seemed to generate the expected dividends of successful dinner parties and a flawless public image. But the fundamentals were rotten. When the first true liability, cruelty, came to light, the entire structure collapsed. Watching her leave brought him no joy, no anger. It brought only the peace of liquidating a bad investment, of cutting a loss before it consumed his entire emotional inheritance. As the front door closed behind her, a breath of fresh air seemed to sweep through the mansion, clearing the last traces of an oppressive atmosphere. That afternoon, the art studio transformed into a workshop of dreams. Richard brought in a set of acrylic paints in every conceivable color and brushes of all sizes. He, Olivia, and Helen sat on the floor amidst spread-out newspapers and began the task of transforming the crutches. Richard's steady hand helped Olivia gently sand the pink surface so the new paint would adhere. Then, guided by her own painting on the canvas, she began to bring the plastic to life. Small white daisies, blue forget-me-nots, and butterflies with vibrant orange wings began to cover the shafts. Helen, with silent tears of joy streaming down her face, painted the delicate green leaves. It was a baptism, a ceremony of reclamation. The crutches were no longer a reminder of the accident or the humiliation. They became an extension of her art, a walking canvas that proclaimed her resilience. Later, as Olivia tested her new, colorful companions down the hall, Richard made the call that would seal his own transformation. Sitting at his small desk in the library, he spoke to his bank manager. "Yes, that's correct. I want to authorize the transfer of that amount for the initial fund. It's the seed money for the foundation." The sum was astronomical, a fraction of his net worth that would make any market analyst question his sanity. But for Richard, no financial decision had ever made more sense. That money, once just numbers on a screen, now had a purpose, a soul. He hung up the phone and looked at his daughter walking toward him, the flowered crutches moving in a confident rhythm. He understood, with a clarity that flooded him with peace, that true wealth wasn't in the assets one accumulates, but in the good one does. This was the best investment of his life, with a return on investment that no stock market could ever offer, the future of his daughter, and of countless other children. A year passed. The mansion, once a mausoleum of cold perfection, now breathed. The walls, which had once displayed only paintings by renowned artists whose names represented a sound investment, now shared space with Olivia's vibrant canvases. The oppressive silence had been replaced by soft music and, more often than not, the crystal sound of her laughter, which now traveled freely through the halls. The greatest luxury in the house was no longer the gold in the decor or the assets stored in vaults, but the atmosphere of warmth and belonging that filled every room. That evening marked the anniversary of the dinner party that had changed everything. There would be no guests, no discussions about the stock market or the profitability of hedge funds. The table in the dining room was not set for 20, but for just 2. In the center, instead of an extravagant floral arrangement, sat a small vase with wildflowers that Olivia and Helen had picked from the garden that afternoon. Richard watched from the doorway, his heart overflowing with an emotion he now recognized as the true fortune of his life. Olivia entered the room, moving with a confidence that was a work of art in itself. The Crutches, her faithful companions, were no longer pink, but a painted tapestry of flowers and butterflies, a declaration of her identity. She carried 2 linen napkins and, with practiced skill, placed them beside the plates. That simple act of helping was a greater victory than any billion-dollar deal he had ever closed. They sat, and the soft lamplight cast a golden glow upon them. The dinner was simple, the conversation easy. He told her about the Pink Butterfly project, which had become a success. He told her how the image of her flowered crutches, now the foundation symbol, was displayed in rehabilitation centers across the country, inspiring other children. "Your suffering, my daughter," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "has been converted into a capital of hope for so many others. You have no idea the good you have done for the world." Olivia smiled, a genuine smile that reached her bright eyes. The girl who had once felt invisible now understood that her story had the power to make others feel seen. The pain of the past had not been erased, but it had been redeemed, transformed into purpose. At the end of dinner, Richard raised his glass of juice, the same juice she was drinking. He looked into his daughter's eyes, seeing reflected there the best of himself, the man he had become because of her. With a voice full of an emotion he no longer tried to hide, he made the toast that had been waiting in his heart. "Love," he said softly, "is the only thing that doesn't need a crutch." Olivia smiled, and a single tear traced a slow path down her cheek. But this time, it was not a tear of pain, shame, or loneliness. It was a tear of relief, of peace, of a happiness so full it had to escape. She wiped it away with the back of her hand and raised her own glass, tapping it against his in a silent toast. Outside, a gentle breeze drifted in through the window, stirring the velvet curtains. The same curtains that had once hidden her crutches and her hopes. Now, there was nothing left to hide. Only the sound of laughter filled the air, echoing through the house. The mansion, once cold and rehearsed, was finally breathing. And anyone who passed by could feel that the true net worth of this place was not kept in safes, but was sitting right at that table in the purest, most non-negotiable form of love.